Good Yontif. There's an old Reader's Digest observation that the only accurate statistic on Election Day is that 100% of Americans will think that 50% of Americans have lost their minds. Our country feels to me like it is in a precariously vulnerable position in this election season. The rabbis of old might have even said that our electoral politics have gone to the birds, particularly unkosher birds, that is. You see, they were fascinated by the mysterious inclusion of the bird Hasidah in the Torah's list of non-kosher birds. They wondered, how could a bird whose name means pious or compassionate one not in fact be kosher? And they answered, the Hasidah was only kind to friends, for creatures just like her, but it stayed away from all the other creatures. As Rabbi Shai Held tartly notes, a bird with exclusively parochial concerns is beyond the pale and just not kosher. Does human nature compel us to imitate the Hasidah, convinced that we're right and that others are fundamentally wrong? Last night, I explored how our obligation to the other might inform our thinking about Israel at this perilous moment. This morning, we'll grapple with similar questions in the context of the upcoming election. More specifically, how can we think and act more Jewishly when we engage with those whose politics are markedly different from our own? The current state of distrust that we have in the political other is troubling. Our fissures are reflected in the survey last year that found that 75% of Americans believe the future of our democracy is at risk, and 23% of us, represented by voters of both parties, agree with the statement that things have gotten so far off track that true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save our country. Jewish legal discourse on our obligations to those who see the world differently repeatedly uses the inflammatory term enemy without ever defining it. At the same time, Judaism almost never approves of us acting on that characterization. The classic example from Exodus 23. When you encounter your enemy's ox or donkey wandering on public property, you must return it. It's common sense. If I find your ox or your iPhone in the public space, I don't get to keep it. And I don't get to pretend that I didn't see it. I must take the time to return it to you, no matter how much I dislike you and everything that you believe in. We live in community together, and that means respecting each other's property. This idea embodies this afternoon's Torah reading when we proclaim, V'ahavta l'oreacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, which Rabbi Akiba of 2,000 years ago viewed as the essence of Torah. A midrash on the Torah's admonition to return lost animals and property offers a deeper reading. When we return a lost item, that kindness may very well begin a transformational thaw between two enemies. Kindness has the capacity to spark friendship between two people who had been at odds with one another. A related text asks, who is a hero? The one who turns an enemy into a friend. There's also a third explanation about the imperative to return an enemy's lost item, which puts the focus on ourselves. Judaism reminds us that when hatred builds up inside us, we change for the worse. As the Talmud puts it, hatred makes the straight crooked. The blogger R.C. Barajas wrote a piece a few years ago entitled, "It's Time to Hate My Neighbors Again." In it, she celebrates the vague détente that permeates her street outside of an election season. But in the run-up to a political contest, she writes about the enmity that is sparked by opposing yard signs. She writes, "Those suspicions and resentments surface like oxygen-starved orcas. And suddenly I find myself annoyed by little things that my neighbors who affiliate with the other party do that I normally wouldn't take notice of, like the stodgy placement of their lawn ornaments, the yapping of their dog, their incorrectly sorted recycling. I glare at the long dead branch of their oak tree whose bleached fingers mar the view from my living room, and I begin to hate the torturous whine of that gas-powered blower that it now seems to me they run every time we plan to eat outside. These thoughts," she says, "do not normally occur to me, but as happens every 4 years, a partisan magnifying glass is scorching a line of demarcation between us, threatening to set our shared fence ablaze." Maybe it would be one thing if Barajas and her neighbors were an isolated case, but if this is every street in America, what is that doing to us as a country and society? Our innate goodness, our straightness, as the Talmud puts it, has become crooked as we lose the ability to tolerate the political other. The rabbis were quite concerned about the toll this negativity might take on us, and so they famously ruled that if we find ourselves struck between helping a loved one and helping an enemy at the same time, we always help our enemies first. Why? To subdue our Yetzer Hara, our evil inclination, they said, by intentionally helping the one we are less inclined to assist, we create a spiritual and ethical practice that protects us from getting corroded by hate. Return to this the next time you board an airplane. We've all been taught that in the event of an emergency, we start by putting on our own oxygen masks. We can't help anyone else if we haven't looked after our own needs first. Now, the FAA says that we help our young people with their mask next. But the rabbis counterintuitively say, you know the obnoxious man sitting behind you who's been kicking you the entire flight? We go out of our way to help him. That guy. That crazy, obnoxious guy, by honoring his needs even as we look after our kids. Are we allowed to get angry when others have values that are starkly different, or when another party's beliefs run counter to our own? Of course we are. We're human beings with strong feelings, and Ecclesiastes 3 says there's a time for loving and a time for hating. Clearly, the biblical author imagined moments when we'd be moved to hate others. But Judaism teaches that those moments are few and far between. Like when one country is at war with another, but when the war ends, we put our feelings aside and we make peace. What about when someone is so awful that they're true evil? Of course, we're permitted to hate them, but our tradition cautions against assuming that their followers merit the same degree of hatred. Judaism limits the permissibility of hate even in the most extreme contexts. Deuteronomy 23:8 says, "Lo tita'ev adomi ki achicha hu." Don't hate the Edomite, an archenemy of ancient Israel, for he is your brother. And the verse continues, Lo tita'ev Mitzri ki ger hayita ve'artso. Even after the centuries-long ordeal of Egyptian slavery, do not even think about hating the Egyptian. Be humble and remember that we were refugees there before they enslaved us. The Torah insists that the ones who see the world fundamentally differently are human beings too. This is the basis for our iconic Seder practice. As we recount each of the 10 plagues, we remove a drop of wine or juice from our cup to recognize the Egyptian suffering. They are human too. Their experience and feelings mattered even as they sought to destroy us. Our obligation to the other, it isn't just rooted in a shared sense of humanity. According to our Haftarah reading later this morning from the book of Isaiah, we are responsible to one another because we are profoundly interdependent on each other. Malbim of 19th century Poland described this theologically as the notion that all human beings are one flesh. I'd like to think that if Malbim was strolling down R.C. Barajas' street in Virginia, he'd see that idea come to life. One person's decision to run a leaf blower or fail to care for their yard can trigger their neighbors, setting off a sequence of unintended relational consequences. And more seriously, this is exactly what Dr. King meant when he said, as long as there is poverty in the world, I can never be rich. As long as diseases are rampant, I can never be totally healthy. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. We are interdependent. We must care for one another because we are one, interconnected with each other. And our oneness is also reflected in the Yom Kippur liturgy. All the confessional prayers we say today are in the plural. It's not that each of us has committed all of the mentioned transgressions, God forbid. It's that we all share responsibility for the behavior and well-being of everyone else. All human beings are one flesh without partisan distinction. We're all part of one country, ultimately responsible to and for each other. There are tangible things that we can do to model this ethos of bipartisan relationship building. We can begin by reaffirming that our synagogue is a nonpartisan space free of judgment so that spiritual seekers of all political persuasions can pray, learn, and serve together. We're not apolitical. We regularly seek Jewish wisdom to understand our current events landscape, but we are not partisan. Our congregation doesn't endorse candidates or parties. Most importantly, we discuss together. We disagree respectfully together. Like the rabbis of old whose debates filled the Talmud, we affirm the value of grappling with ideas together. Practicing these values in our spiritual home is a first step in trying to bring healing to our fractured country. We can also become ever more conscious of our use of social media and cable news and the ways that media contributes to our country's division. Wouldn't we all be better served if we spent a little less time on our screens? At the very least, diversify the content you're absorbing. As the Talmud teaches, every student of Torah must seek out more than one teacher. There is danger in situating oneself in an echo chamber with one worldview. Our path forward is exposure to multiple perspectives to better understand and dialogue with those who see the world differently. In that spirit, I want to invite you to join me on Sunday, November 17th, as we screen the remarkable 2023 documentary, Undivide Us, which explores what can happen when ordinary citizens encounter one another outside of hostile partisan conflict. After the film, we'll reflect together, talk about how we might further these efforts. My hope is that we will be moved to courageously seek out conversations with those who see the issues differently than we do, because change will only come one dialogue at a time. Our rabbis taught, in 3 ways do people differ: regarding the sound of their voice, their unique physical appearance, and their opinions and perspectives. Most of us strive to minimize Let's try that again. Most of us strive to minimize bias when it comes to the sound of a person's voice or their physical appearance, but far too many of us struggle with the question of how to treat the one who sees the world differently. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks named his most famous book after this moral imperative. He called it The Dignity of Difference. He encouraged us to celebrate differences and embrace them because they make our communities and societies stronger. Our tradition insists that we bend over backwards to honor the humanity of the other, that we might ultimately transform our suspicion and resentment into neighborly respect, even as our principled disagreements remain. We Jews have a blessing for everything. And it turns out that that includes a blessing if one attends a large political rally and witnesses a crowd. The blessing is an unusual one. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam chacham harazim. Blessed are you, sovereign of the universe, who is wise, knowing all of our secrets. It's natural for us, looking at a crowd, to assume that everyone shares an ideology or perspective. But the blessing reminds us that within that large crowd are hundreds or thousands of individuals. Just as there's a diversity of voices and appearances, so too does each person in that crowd have a different story, a different reason why they came to that event. And until we get to know them individually, we ought not presume that they're good people or bad people, friend or enemy. Our country is hurting. And regardless of the results of November's election, we, the people, will be in desperate need of healing. Half of us will feel disenfranchised, unsure of what to make of the ones who voted for the other party. Let us not be like the mythical bird of old called Hasidah, pious in name only, identifying only with the ones who vote like us. Rather, let us aspire to authentic Hasidut, or piety, committed to an ethic that makes room for the one who is different. In doing so, may we recognize that e pluribus unum is not just a motto. It is a sacred truth. Out of many, we are one. One country, one humanity, always stronger because of what we share in common, rather than that which threatens to set us apart. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May this be God's will.